July 12, 1943. The southern face of the Kursk salient burned under a sunless sky. Black smoke curled above the wheat fields, turning noon into dusk. Shells screamed through the haze, ripping open the earth where men had stood seconds before. The smell of fuel and scorched metal clung to the air like a poison. Inside a battered Soviet T-34, vision was reduced to nothing. Just gray, choking dust. The crew could hear the thunder of German Tigers closing in, their engines deep and unhurried, like predators certain of the kill. The gunner wiped his eyes, coughing. His commander shouted something, muffled, lost in the roar of machine guns outside. Through the gun sight, there was only fog. No silhouette, no target, just instinct. He turned the turret by feel, calculating from sound alone. The heavy clatter of treads, the pattern of ricochets. The loader slammed in a shell. The others told him he was wasting it. He fired anyway, a blinding flash, then silence. Through the clearing, smoke, a Tiger tank burned, its turret split open. The laughter in the cramped T-34 died instantly. They had mocked the shot, until the impossible hit found its mark. By the summer of 1943, the Second World War had reached a brutal balance. The German army, once unstoppable, had bled deeply in the snows of Stalingrad. Now, the Eastern Front stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a scar of trenches, wreckage, and frozen fear. Hitler sought redemption, a decisive blow to restore the Wehrmacht's fading aura of invincibility. His eyes turned to a bulge on the map, a curved protrusion in central Russia, around the city of Kursk. There, Soviet advances had created a deep salient into German lines. To Hitler, it was an invitation. Surround it from north and south, crush the Red Army inside, and reclaim the initiative. He named it Operation Citadel, a counterstroke meant to prove that Germany could still dictate the course of the war. It would be, he declared, the greatest tank battle in history. He wasn't wrong, though not in the way he imagined. Across the steppes, Soviet intelligence already knew what was coming. Through intercepted communications and partisan reports, Stalin's high command, the Stavka, had mapped out every German assembly area, every armored concentration. Unlike the desperate chaos of 1941, the Red Army of 1943 was disciplined, fortified, and waiting. While German engineers repaired and tuned their Panther and Tiger tanks, Soviet workers dug. They built belts of defense, 7 deep, with minefields stretching for miles, trenches, anti-tank ditches, and camouflaged gun nests. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers prepared to meet 500,000 Germans. The air hummed with the sound of shovels and the drone of aircraft ferrying supplies. In Berlin, generals pleaded for delay. The new tanks were untested, the terrain unfavorable, and the Soviets too well prepared. But Hitler refused to listen. He saw in Citadel not just strategy, but ideology, proof that German will could overcome any setback. The operation was postponed again and again as the Führer waited for every technical edge: new shells, reinforced armor, and the debut of the Panther. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to entrench. When the attack finally came on July 5, 1943, the steppe shook under the weight of 2 armies. At dawn, more than 2,000 German tanks surged forward, their black crosses cutting through the mist. From the Soviet lines, artillery answered with a roar that seemed to tear the sky itself apart. The largest tank engagement in human history had begun. The air filled with the metallic shriek of treads, the thunder of 88 mm guns, and the cry of dive bombers streaking down from the clouds. Soviet commanders reported that the earth itself seemed to breathe. Each explosion a heaving pulse underfoot. Every field became a furnace, every ridge a graveyard of iron. In this vast collision, technology and tactics blurred into chaos. The Germans possessed the mightiest tanks ever built, the Tiger I and the newly introduced Panther, armored giants with killing range unmatched on the field. But for every Tiger, there were 5 Soviet T-34s waiting, smaller, faster, and far easier to replace. Behind the numbers, there was fear. For the men inside those steel beasts, the war had shrunk to a few inches of armor. A hit could turn their world into flame in a heartbeat. And yet, in that inferno, courage persisted. Tank crews fought in dust so thick they could barely breathe, relying on instinct, on the faint glint of movement in a smoke-filled gun sight. Among them was a single Soviet crew whose blind shot would soon echo across history. A moment born from this crucible of attrition and desperation. Because at Kursk, every engagement, every heartbeat, was a duel between annihilation and survival. A test of who would blink first in the fog of war. The Kursk salient was unlike any battlefield before it. Rolling fields of wheat, dry gullies, and low ridges stretched for miles, deceptively open, yet deadly. Every hill concealed a Soviet gun nest. Every patch of ground hid a web of mines. The summer heat baked the soil into a crust that cracked beneath tank treads, filling the air with dust so thick it hung like smoke. For the Germans, the assault was a nightmare of design. What should have been a lightning strike became a crawl through fire. Tigers and Panthers, the pride of the Panzerwaffe, advanced slowly, their wide tracks crunching over mine belts. Behind them came waves of Panzer V's and infantry, pinned under an unending barrage from Soviet artillery hidden beyond the ridge lines. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, found itself contested at every turn. The Soviet Air Force, rebuilt, aggressive, and coordinated, swept overhead in tight formations of Il-2 Sturmovix, their 23mm cannons shredding convoys and tank columns alike. Smoke trails marked where dogfights spiraled down into oblivion. On the ground, tank warfare had evolved into a science of survival. Crews spoke less of honor and more of mathematics. Range, armor angle, shell velocity. The German Tiger Warns, mounting the fearsome 80-80 Keet Tiamitz 36, could destroy a T-34 from over 1,500 meters, long before the Soviets could reply. But those numbers meant little in the choking fog of real combat. When visibility dropped to a few dozen meters, the battlefield belonged not to the machine, but to the man who dared to shoot first. Soviet doctrine called for defense in depth, a strategy of bleeding the Germans through layers of resistance. Anti-tank guns were positioned in staggered rows, overlapping fields of fire. Camouflaged positions dotted the landscape. Dug-in T-34s, hidden 76mm ZIS-3 guns, and portable PTRD rifles for close encounters. Even when outgunned, Soviet crews relied on cunning. They ambushed from concealment, fired, then shifted positions before the Tigers could respond. In the southern sector near Prokhorovka, the fighting was the most intense. Here, the elite German Durchsetzung SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser advanced against the Soviet Fifth Guards tank army led by General Rotmistrov. It was a collision of doctrines, precision against momentum, training against tenacity. More than 2,200 tanks would clash in this sector alone. By dawn on July 12th, the battlefield had transformed into a maelstrom of metal and fire. The Germans pushed toward the small villages lining the Sel River. Soviet T-34s charged headlong into their guns, sometimes ramming Tigers at close range to jam their turrets. Others maneuvered through smoke and wreckage, firing at flashes rather than shapes. Inside one such Soviet formation, a single T-34 crew found themselves trapped amid burning wrecks. Communication lines were gone. Smoke blinded every periscope. They could hear engines rumbling nearby. Deep, heavy, deliberate. To a trained ear, it could only mean one thing: Tiger tanks. The Tigers operated differently from other panzers. Their commanders preferred to hold ground, covering each other with interlocking fields of fire. Each was a fortress, 57 tons of armor and precision machinery, with optical sights that could spot a target over a kilometer away. To the Soviet crews facing them, they were monsters cloaked in smoke. But monsters had weaknesses. The Tiger's slow traverse, its mechanical complexity, and its exposed flanks offered narrow windows of opportunity. In the chaos of Kursk, these moments lasted seconds, but they were enough. As the battle raged on, communication broke down completely. Smoke from burning oil and ammunition dumps rolled across the steppe. Visibility dropped to almost zero. Crews shouted coordinates no one could hear, fired at sounds they couldn't see. It was warfare stripped of order, reduced to instinct, training, and sheer nerve. In that confusion, one Soviet gunner, unknown to history but immortalized in Soviet records, made a decision that seemed absurd. His commander could see nothing through the sight. No outline, no movement. But the gunner listened, counted the rhythm of the engines, the echo of shells striking earth, the fraction of delay between shots. Then he aimed at what he believed was the Tiger's command vehicle. What followed would become one of the most improbable hits in armored warfare. A single, blind shot fired through smoke and guesswork. A strike that would rip open the enemy's command link and alter the tempo of the southern offensive. The moment was near. But before that shot echoed, the world had to collapse into chaos. Inside a World War II tank, the outside world ceased to exist. The crew lived in a world of vibration, heat, and noise. The air reeked of oil, sweat, and propellant gas. Every breath felt borrowed. Inside the T-34, 4 men operated in a space smaller than a household bathroom. The gunner crouched at the center, his eye pressed to a sight that shook with each shell fired. The loader's hands were raw, burned from hot casings. The driver saw the battlefield through a slit no wider than a postcard. Communication was a ritual of shouts and instinct. Headphones rarely worked under constant shelling. Orders came as gestures. A hand raised, a tap on the shoulder, a shouted curse drowned by the engine. When the Tiger's 88mm guns fired, the shockwave rattled bones. To the Soviet crews, survival depended not only on armor or aim, but on trust. The bond between crew members was unspoken and absolute. They had trained together, eaten together, and watched friends burn alive in other machines. There was no room for doubt, only shared instinct. In that unity lay their only advantage, a kind of human synchronization no machine could replicate. For these men, courage wasn't a heroic surge. It was the ability to keep breathing when logic said stop, to stay inside a burning tank, to reload while knowing another shell could penetrate any second, to fire blind when fear screamed for silence. It was endurance, not glory. And in that endurance, they became something unbreakable. The T-34 and the Tiger RI were not just machines. They were philosophies cast in steel. The Soviet T-34 embodied simplicity and speed. It was built not for perfection, but for production. Its 76.2mm F-34 gun could pierce most German tanks at medium range, and its sloped armor, a revolutionary feature, deflected rounds that would have shattered other hulls. It could travel over soft ground, climb hills, and be repaired in the field with minimal tools. Each factory turned them out by the hundreds. For every Tiger lost, the Soviets could field 10 T-34s. The Tiger Y, by contrast, was an instrument of precision, engineered with German obsession. Its thick armor made it nearly invulnerable from the front. Its optics, crafted by Zeiss, offered magnification and clarity unmatched on the battlefield. At long range, the Tiger was untouchable. It destroyed enemies before they even saw it. But its perfection came at a cost: complexity. Its transmission was fragile, its maintenance endless, and its fuel consumption enormous. A single Tiger required the logistics of an entire platoon to keep it moving. On paper, the Tiger reigned supreme. In the dust and heat of Kursk, it was less certain. Its narrow tracks bogged in soft ground. Its weight crushed bridges and slowed advances. And most critically, its advantage of visibility vanished when smoke and dust swallowed the steppe. At close range, where silhouettes blurred and seconds mattered, the Tiger's strength became irrelevant. The T-34's faster turret, quicker acceleration, and lower profile turned it into a hunter by instinct. In those moments, technology bowed to chaos. German doctrine emphasized Kampfgruppen, combined arms units of tanks, infantry, and artillery moving in tight coordination. Their goal was precision: identify, engage, destroy. Every Tiger moved with supporting vehicles to guard its flanks. Each advance was calculated. The Tiger's long-range accuracy meant engagements were supposed to occur beyond 1,000 meters. The Soviet doctrine was the opposite: aggression through overwhelming presence. Their units advanced en masse, often under crushing fire, to close the distance and neutralize the German range advantage. If a Tiger could kill at 1,500 meters, the Soviet answer was to fight at 500. To get that close, they used smokescreens, artillery barrages, and sacrificial maneuvers. At Kursk, this clash of doctrines became a paradox. The Germans, advancing through defenses, lost their coordination in minefields and shell fire. The Soviets, meant to absorb the blow, counterattacked earlier than expected. By mid-battle, both sides fought in conditions no manual had prepared them for: blind, deaf, and surrounded by burning machines. A Tiger platoon might engage enemies it could not see. A Soviet crew might fire at echoes. Tactics devolved into intuition. And intuition was what the Soviets excelled at. The gunner who would take the blind shot had learned that doctrine on instinct. He knew how to listen to the rhythm of battle, how to judge distance by sound, to sense direction by echo. In a world where visibility meant nothing, his mind became the only rangefinder. That was the new law of the steppe. When the air turns black and the machines lose their eyes, victory belongs to the man who fires first and believes. The smoke that blanketed Kursk was more than a weapon. It was an equalizer. And within that gray haze, both giants, the Tiger and the T-34, became ghosts, circling each other by sound alone. It was here that fate, instinct, and technology would collide in a single deafening shot. There is a unique terror in not seeing your enemy. For most soldiers, death comes from distance: a shell, a bullet, a bomb, unseen, unstoppable. But for tankers, that blindness is multiplied 100-fold. Their world is reduced to narrow periscopes and instruments that lie as often as they help. In the smoke of Kursk, even those failed. When visibility dropped to nothing, men relied on rhythm: the pounding pulse of engines, the vibration through the hull, the tremor of each distant impact. Every sound became information. Every second of silence felt like eternity. The Soviet crews called this state Cherny Ad, the Black Hell. Gunners fired where they felt the enemy was. Loaders screamed out ammunition types without knowing the range. Drivers kept the tanks moving in half circles, trying to avoid becoming fixed targets. Inside, temperatures reached over 50 degrees Celsius. Sweat stung their eyes. The smell of cordite mixed with burning paint. Men shouted names, prayers, coordinates, all swallowed by the noise. Courage, in this blindness, became something different. It was not the courage of charge or command, but of patience, the will to act when nothing could be confirmed. The blind shot was not born of recklessness, but of trained instinct pushed past human limits. In the haze of Kursk, Survival was less about sight and more about intuition, a wordless, sensory calculation that defined life and death. For those men, fear was constant. They did not overcome it. They carried it like another piece of equipment, bolted into the hull beside them. On the other side of the battlefield, inside a German Tiger Wehrmacht, the experience was no less harrowing. Though the Tiger was built for domination, its crew faced their own prison of steel. Each of the 5 men relied on precision, a symphony of coordination and discipline drilled to perfection. But in the dust and smoke of Kursk, that precision broke down. The Tiger's optics, its greatest advantage, were useless in the blinding haze. The rangefinder lenses fogged from the heat. The gunner saw only shifting shadows. Enemy shells slammed into the thick armor, shaking the entire vehicle like an earthquake. Each impact that didn't penetrate still felt like a hammer blow. German radio chatter was frantic. Commanders tried to restore order, shouting coordinates over interference. But the battlefield was a labyrinth of wreckage, friend and foe indistinguishable. Reports came of panthers bursting into flames after mechanical failure. Others hit mines and blocked routes of retreat. The once coordinated panzer formations had dissolved into isolated duels fought at point-blank range. One Tiger, marked with the insignia of a command vehicle, took position behind a hedgerow of burning trees. Inside, the commander scanned through his periscope, searching for any movement. The ground vibrated with approaching engines, distant but closing. He ordered his gunner to hold fire. He wanted confirmation before revealing his position. He would never get it. A shell, unseen, unanticipated, struck the front of the turret ring. The explosion blew the hatch open, tearing through the command cupola. The Tiger's ammunition ignited seconds later. The tank erupted in a column of flame that pierced the smoke like a flare. In a single moment, the nerve center of the local assault was gone. That was the shot. That was the blind, impossible strike that no one had seen, yet everyone would soon feel. War often disguises chance as heroism. The shell that struck the command Tiger could have missed by a meter. The smoke could have shifted. The wind could have turned. The gunner could have hesitated for half a second. But none of that happened. A single decision, made in a fraction of time, changed the course of a local engagement, and possibly saved hundreds of lives. For the Soviets, the shot became legend, a testament to instinct, skill, and unyielding will. For the Germans, it was another reminder that even superiority of engineering could not guarantee victory. Both sides drew their own meaning from it. But at its core, the event revealed something universal: the terrifying randomness of survival. War has always blurred the line between precision and luck. Every general's plan depends on thousands of tiny, uncontrollable moments: fog, dust, timing, fear. At Kursk, those moments multiplied until command and control dissolved. The battle was not won by machines or maps, but by the men inside them, operating on the edge of reason. The blind shot was more than a miracle. It was the perfect symbol of what the Eastern Front had become. A struggle where courage met chaos, where victory could emerge from a gesture made in blindness, a human pulse beating against the mechanical roar of total war. As the Tiger command tank burned, confusion rippled through German lines. Orders went unanswered. Radio silence spread. For the Soviets watching through the thinning smoke, it was the first unmistakable sign. The enemy had faltered. The next phase of the story begins in that silence. The instant realization that a single shot had shifted the rhythm of battle. The smoke was so thick, it seemed to have weight. It rolled low over the steppe, clinging to the ground, turning daylight into a red-tinted twilight. Visibility had dropped to nothing. The sound of engines and explosions merged into a single, endless vibration that made every nerve tremble. Inside one of the Soviet T-34s of the 5th Guards Tank Army, The men could see no more than a few meters ahead. Their tank had already taken shrapnel hits. The commander's periscope was cracked. The gunner's sight was half obscured by dust from an earlier near miss. Somewhere beyond the haze, Tigers were advancing, their 88mm guns firing with deliberate rhythm, each shot like a heartbeat of doom. The Soviet formation had been thrown into confusion. Dozens of tanks were disabled or burning. Radio chatter had dissolved into static. The commander leaned forward, trying to catch any flicker of movement through the slit, but there was only fire and drifting ash. Every few seconds, another explosion rippled through the earth. The loader, trembling, reached for a new shell. Armor-piercing, 76 minutes, Grimtors. He glanced at the gunner. The gunner didn't move. He was listening. Target? No answer. Only the hum of the turret motor and the distant growl of German engines. The gunner placed one gloved hand on the steel rim of his sight, the other on the traverse wheel. He began to turn, slowly, methodically. Outside, a shell detonated close by, spraying soil against the hull like a rain of gravel. The commander cursed, ordered a shift in position, but the driver could barely see where to go. He edged the tank forward 2 meters, stopped, reversed half a meter, feeling more than steering. They were blind, trapped in a storm of their own artillery smoke. And yet, through that blindness, the gunner's training took over. He counted, not seconds, but sounds. The engine's rumble, the crack of a tiger's shot, the echo of its impact. Each sound revealed direction and distance. Somewhere ahead, a heavier engine, slower, deeper, idled with an authority distinct from the rest. That was no ordinary Tiger. That was the command tank. He adjusted elevation, compensating for the slope of the ground. He exhaled slowly, hand steady on the trigger. The commander shouted again, "You can't see it!" But the gunner had already decided. He fired. The recoil slammed through the T-34 like a hammer strike. The sound inside the hull was deafening. A second later came the hollow concussion of impact. Not the sharp clang of a ricochet, but a deeper, final sound. Penetration. Then, silence. Even the constant thunder seemed to pause for an instant. The crew looked at one another, uncertain. Through the periscope, the commander saw only swirling dust. No confirmation, no flame, nothing. The loader reached for another shell. The gunner was already aligning for a follow-up shot when the air outside shifted. The dust began to part. A glow emerged through the haze, faint at first, then brighter, pulsing orange. The Tiger's silhouette became visible for just a heartbeat. Turret blown open, flames spewing from the command cupola. A muffled explosion followed, and the tank's massive shape sagged, then collapsed into itself. It was real. The impossible had happened. The blind shot had struck dead center on the command vehicle. The Soviet crew sat frozen, each trying to comprehend what they'd done. The commander exhaled, slow and disbelieving. Then, without a word, he ordered the driver to advance, to exploit the chaos they could sense was spreading beyond the smoke. Through the radio, one of the few still working, came fragmented messages. Enemy command tank destroyed. German formation stalled. Push forward. For the first time that day, the tide seemed to shift. Beyond the burning wreck, other Soviet tanks began to re-emerge from the haze. They moved cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. German fire slackened. Without their command vehicle's coordination, the Tigers lost their rhythm, each operating on its own, firing blindly into the smoke. The gunner stared at his sight. He hadn't truly seen his target. Not once. And yet, somehow, the trajectory, the sound, the instinct had aligned in one perfect instant. He would never know exactly how, only that, for once, chance had chosen his side. That was how the battlefield turned. Not by grand strategy, but by a single, unseen moment of human calculation in the void. The burning Tiger marked the heart of that change. A signal fire through the fog of war. The turning point on the southern front of Kursk. But the battle wasn't over. The Germans would rally, regroup, and counterattack, desperate to restore order amid the ruins. And the Soviet tankers who had made that shot would soon find themselves facing the full fury of their enemy's revenge. For several seconds, there was only the low crackle of fire. The smoke hung in the air, stirred only by the hot wind of exploding ammunition. The wrecked Tiger burned like a furnace, its ammunition cooking off in short, violent bursts that echoed across the steppe. No one inside survived. But the true impact of that shot was not measured in that single tank's destruction. It was in the confusion it unleashed. That Tiger had not been just another vehicle. It had been a command tank of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, one of the nerve centers directing the southern spearhead of Operation Citadel. The officer inside, believed to be a battalion staff commander, had been coordinating artillery support and tank maneuvers via radio. When the shell tore through the turret and set the compartment ablaze, his transmission cut out mid-sentence. To the German armored units pushing forward through the smoke, that silence was catastrophic. They had been advancing under precise, centralized control, each movement synchronized by command frequencies. Now, those frequencies were dead. The frontline units didn't know whether to halt, turn, or continue pushing east. The first to notice the break were the radio operators of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division, advancing toward Prokhorovka. Their attempts to contact the command tank were met with static. Reports came back confused. HQ not responding. New orders unclear. In that moment of hesitation, the Soviet artillery batteries seized the opportunity. On the ridgeline behind the T-34 units, the 152mm howitzers of the 18th Guards Artillery Regiment began firing again. They had been waiting for coordinates, and now, spotting the burning Tiger through binoculars, they took it as the new aim point. Within minutes, hundreds of shells thundered down in a semicircle, targeting the forward edge of the German advance. The field became an inferno. Shells exploded among the advancing panzers, flipping some onto their sides. Tracers stitched across the haze. The Soviet tank brigades, sensing the shift, began to surge forward again, engines roaring as they closed the distance. What had been a near collapse just minutes before now turned into a countercharge. Dozens of T-34s and KV-1s advanced side by side, emerging ghost-like from the smoke. Dirty, scorched, but relentless. Their machine guns rattled continuously, their 76mm guns flashing in every direction. The Germans, momentarily leaderless, tried to reorient. Some Tigers halted and fired point-blank into the advancing line. But without coordination, their shots went wide or struck already burning targets. On the Soviet command net, a single phrase repeated, "Hold nothing back. Push through the smoke." To the men on the ground, it was unclear who had issued the order, but it didn't matter. Momentum itself had taken command. By early afternoon, the southern battlefield of Kursk had transformed into a churning sea of wreckage. The earth trembled under constant detonations. Smoke columns rose thousands of feet high, visible for miles. Observers later compared it to a volcanic eruption. Not a battle, but a single living organism consuming itself. At the center of it all, the wrecked Tiger continued to burn, a grim landmark visible even through the storm. Soviet units used it as a navigation point, a crude beacon guiding their advance. Each platoon that passed it slowed for just a moment, staring at the ruin of what had once been their deadliest enemy. Somewhere amid that chaos, the original T-34 crew had fallen silent again. Their tank now bore new scars, side hits from 50mm rounds, the turret ring stiff from heat. They had no idea what their shot had truly caused. They only knew they'd survived longer than expected. The gunner, still shaking from the recoil, loaded another round. His commander kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where new silhouettes were forming, fresh German reinforcements moving in from the southwest. But even those reinforcements struggled. As they approached, radio confusion spread like wildfire. Several German tank commanders received conflicting coordinates, some ordering withdrawal, others calling for renewed attack. The once pristine German chain of command, known for its precision, was collapsing into fragments. The blind shot had not merely destroyed a tank, it had destroyed communication. And in a battle like Kursk, where every unit depended on radio guidance amid the blinding smoke and chaos, that was fatal. The German spearhead, the elite armored divisions of the Waffen-SS, began to lose cohesion. Columns drifted apart. Flanking elements lost contact. The perfect machine that had driven across Europe began to stutter, gear by gear, until it broke down completely. By the time the sun dipped behind the smoke that evening, the battlefield had changed hands several times. Neither side could claim a full victory, but the strategic momentum had shifted. The Soviets held the ridgeline. The German advance had stalled, and within 48 hours, Hitler himself would order the offensive called off. That single moment, a gunner's impossible shot through the fog, had rippled outward through thousands of lives and machines. It became a symbol among Soviet tank crews, proof that instinct, courage, and chance could outweigh even the might of the German armor. Years later, survivors from that unit would still speak of it, not as a tale of heroism, but as something almost supernatural, an act that defied logic in a war defined by precision and engineering. They called it simply the blind shot. And though history would never record the gunner's name with certainty, his action would live on in Soviet war records, retold in mess halls and memorials long after the steppe had grown quiet again. By July 13, 1943, Operation Citadel was dead. The largest armored offensive in history, Hitler's final bid to regain the Eastern Initiative, had ground to a halt. What began as a calculated strike with over 2,700 German tanks ended in attrition, confusion, and fire. The field around Prokhorovka was now unrecognizable. Thousands of wrecks littered the landscape. Twisted hulls of T-34s and Panthers, melted tracks, burned-out Tigers still smoking days after the battle. The steppe stank of oil and iron, of scorched earth, and the silence that follows exhaustion. When the shooting stopped, the scale of destruction became clear. German armored forces had lost nearly 1,500 tanks, many abandoned or immobilized by mechanical failure, others destroyed outright. The Soviets had lost more, but they could replace them within weeks. The Germans could not. That was the real turning point of Kursk. For the first time since 1941, the Wehrmacht had exhausted its offensive power. Its new weapons, the Panthers and Tigers that had been meant to dominate the battlefield, had failed to deliver decisive victory. Too few, too fragile, too dependent on supply lines that now stretched thin and brittle. Behind the front, Soviet field engineers worked tirelessly to salvage what they could. Crews towed disabled tanks, stripped usable parts, and buried their dead in rows marked by makeshift crosses and red stars. Among them, somewhere near the village of Yakovlevo, lay the remains of the unknown T-34s. T-34 crew, whose shot had destroyed the German command tank. Their names, like so many others, vanished into paperwork and memory. But the impact of their act lived on in reports. Soviet divisional summaries described the event in dry, factual tone. One enemy command tank destroyed by direct hit. Following confusion led to artillery strike on German formation. Yet those lines hid something deeper. Morale. For the Red Army, Kursk was more than a battlefield. It was a proof that the German war machine could be stopped, broken, and pushed back. Proof that Soviet strategy, planning, and endurance could stand against Hitler's best. And among soldiers, stories spread quickly. They spoke of the tank that fired blind, of the shell that struck where no man could see. It became a talismanic tale, retold around campfires, in factory posters, in the quiet pride of surviving crews. For the Germans, Kursk was a reckoning. What had begun as a confident strike ended with Hitler's furious order to withdraw. The Eastern Front would never again move eastward for Germany. Every battle after Kursk, from Dnieper to Berlin, would be defensive. Strategically, the defeat was amplified by timing. Just days after Hitler called off Citadel, the Allies landed in Sicily. Germany was now fighting on all fronts, east, west, and south, with diminishing reserves. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich had begun to unravel in the dust of the Russian steppe. In the ruins of the battlefield, German soldiers scavenged what they could before retreating. Many of their radio logs were found by advancing Soviet units. Half-burned pages filled with broken communications, lost coordinates, and incomplete orders. One such entry, dated July 12th, ended abruptly mid-transmission. Command tank hit. No contact. Repeating? No. That silence became symbolic. Where once precision and control had defined the Wehrmacht, chaos and confusion had taken hold. A single blind shell had exposed the fragility of an entire system built on perfect order. The Soviets advanced cautiously, wary of traps and mines. By the end of the month, the salient around Kursk had been cleared. German forces pulled back hundreds of kilometers. From that point onward, the Red Army would never again lose the strategic initiative. Kursk was not just a Soviet victory. It was the beginning of Germany's irreversible decline. And buried beneath that tide of history lay countless small stories, each one a fragment of the whole. The human scale within the machinery of war. Among them, the story of one nameless gunner who fired blind and changed the course of a day. And, in a way, the course of the war itself. In Berlin, the reports from Kursk arrived slowly, fragmented, contradictory, and soaked in excuses. Staff officers tried to dress the defeat in technical terms. Temporary withdrawal, local setback, enemy superiority in reserves. But the truth was unmistakable even to Hitler himself. The era of German offensive warfare was over. The Eastern Front had swallowed Germany's finest divisions. Entire Panzer Corps had been reduced to shadows of their former strength. Factories in the Reich could no longer replace tanks as fast as they burned on the steppe. Even the mighty Tiger, once hailed as invincible, was now being outproduced and outmaneuvered by the swarming Soviet T-34s. Hitler's response was fury mixed with denial. He blamed his generals, especially Manstein and Model, for not breaking through fast enough. He accused his tank designers of betrayal, calling the Panther a child born too early. In private meetings, his outbursts grew more erratic. He ordered that no further large-scale offensives be launched in the East without his explicit approval, a decision that crippled German flexibility for the rest of the war. Meanwhile, the Soviets were already moving. Within days of Citadel's collapse, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky ordered massive counteroffensives along the Orel and Belgorod sectors. The exhausted Wehrmacht had no strength left to resist. By August, the Red Army had advanced more than 150 kilometers west, liberating cities that had been under occupation for 2 years. For the soldiers who had fought at Kursk, the transition from defense to pursuit felt surreal. They had survived the storm, and now they were chasing it away. Tank brigades rolled through villages reduced to rubble, greeted by civilians who had hidden underground through weeks of bombardment. Each step westward was heavy with loss, but lit by the knowledge that, at last, the tide had turned. Western Allied intelligence took notice too. Reports from the Soviet front reached London and Washington, confirming that Germany's armored might had been shattered. Churchill called it the greatest tank battle in history, and the end of the German dream in the East. From that moment onward, every plan, from the invasion of Italy to the Normandy landings, rested on one crucial assumption: the Red Army would keep pushing, and Hitler would never recover the initiative. For Germany's soldiers, however, the psychological toll was immense. Letters home, intercepted later by Allied censors, spoke of disillusionment and fatigue. One young panzer crewman wrote, "At Kursk, we saw our strength melt away. The Russians came in waves, endless, fearless. We could destroy them, but they always returned. We have learned what it means to fight a war that cannot be won." Inside the Soviet Union, Kursk became legend almost overnight. Newspapers published heroic accounts of tank duels, artillery barrages, and soldiers who refused to yield an inch. Propaganda posters depicted the T-34 as the embodiment of Soviet resilience, the steel heart of victory. And among those stories, scattered between official bulletins and whispered campfire tales, the story of the blind shot reappeared again and again. In some versions, the gunner survived. In others, he perished moments later. What mattered was not the details, but the symbolism. It captured the essence of Kursk, a victory born not just from numbers or technology, but from human instinct, courage, and timing. To Soviet commanders, the lesson was clear. Preparation, intelligence, and layered defense could defeat even the most sophisticated enemy. After Kursk, the Red Army refined its doctrines: deeper echelons, greater artillery coordination, and overwhelming mobility. These methods would carry them all the way to Berlin 2 years later. For the Germans, Kursk was a lesson learned too late. The dream of blitzkrieg, fast, decisive warfare, had died in the mud and minefields of the Russian summer. From now on, Germany would fight in retreat, improvising defense after defense, burning through its last reserves. And yet, in the archives and personal accounts, one detail kept resurfacing. That command Tiger destroyed by a single Soviet shell, fired without sight, in the middle of chaos. It stood as a haunting metaphor for the war itself. A vast machine undone not by superior force, but by the limits of control, by chance, by the simple unpredictability of battle. By the time the snows returned to the steppe that winter, the wrecks of Kursk had been stripped for scrap. Grass grew where tanks had burned. Only shallow scars in the earth marked where trenches once ran. But beneath that soil, history had already shifted. From that day onward, the German army would move only one direction: backward. The Battle of Kursk did not end with celebration. It ended in silence, a silence heavy with smoke, loss, and the realization that the war's balance had shifted forever. When historians look back, they see numbers: divisions destroyed, tanks lost, kilometers gained. But for the men who fought there, Kursk was not a map. It was sound and fire. The roar of engines, the smell of burning steel, the split second between life and death. In that vast machine of destruction, one act, one shot, seems almost too small to matter. And yet it does. Because wars are not decided only by plans or leaders, but by moments of human instinct. Moments when a single decision, made in confusion and terror, ripples outward through the machinery of history. The gunner who fired blind that day could not have known what his shell would strike. He did not see the command tank, nor the chain of events it would unravel. But his shot became a symbol of something greater. The power of resilience over precision, of chaos over control. For all of Hitler's obsession with perfect engineering, it was randomness, a blind shell in the smoke, that exposed the fragility of his vision. For all of Stalin's cold planning, it was the courage of ordinary men that carried his armies forward. That is the paradox of Kursk. The largest armored battle in history, defined by machinery, decided by instinct, a war of steel, won by human will. Decades later, when veterans were asked what they remembered most, they did not speak of victory or defeat. They spoke of noise, of the ground shaking, of comrades vanishing in seconds, of the unbearable weight of silence after the guns stopped. And sometimes they spoke of luck, the thin, invisible line between survival and death. In the end, the blind shot is more than a story of one tank or one battle. It is a reminder of the chaos that underlies even the most ordered wars, that no plan, no machine, no empire is immune to the randomness of fate. Because in that moment, amid smoke and fire, history did not turn because someone saw clearly. It turned because someone fired blind, and the world changed course. And so the steppe grew quiet again, its grass reclaiming the scars, its soil hiding the iron bones beneath. But in that silence, the echo of that single shot still lingers, a reminder that in the heart of war, the smallest spark can alter the path of nations.